This Choircast podcast episode is brought to you by my book, Breaking Bad Faith, Exposing Myth and Violence in Popular Theology to Recover the Path of Peace. I'm Michael Camp. The book helps people break damaging beliefs that are based on myths. It exposes the big lie that God brings justice through retribution, punishment, imprisonment, the death penalty, lenient gun laws, American wars, final judgment, and eternal damnation. Find it at Amazon.com.
The majority of our life is lived in liminal space.
And there's this in-between space, this liminal space.
This liminality that reveals possibility.
I think we're in a liminal moment, but also in a place of transformation. We could actually change as a people.
I have great affection for the church and a troubled relationship with it.
That can't be the gospel because God said to love our neighbors.
Just to be alive in time means that we're on the threshold of the future.
Just to begin questioning is so difficult because you have these voices in your ears telling you that you're not a real Christian.
We don't know what the future looks like. We have to work it out together.
Welcome to the Liminal Living podcast, where we have conversations with those who are going through dark nights or deconstruction. Well, David Hayward, the naked pastor, welcome to the Liminal Living podcast, and it's great to see you have clothes on today.
Thanks, Tom. Good to see you too. Thanks for having me on your show.
Well, I've been wanting to have you on the show I'm on season 4, and you are on my list right when I was putting together my dream team list of who I'd love to talk to. And then I talked to Jackie Turner, and she says, let me send that email for you. And that's how we kind of came together. Cool. So I'm really excited.
Thank you, Jackie.
Yes, thank you, Jackie. Shout out to Jackie Turner. Go buy her books. She's amazing. Link in the notes. So, yeah. Well, you kind of have this prolific, if I may use that word, social media presence. I'll tell people that I'm interviewing you today and they say, oh, I don't know who that is. And then I mention, well, he runs the Naked Pastor. And then I'll show them a cartoon that you've written and you're like, oh, that guy. Yeah, I know that guy. Like you have permeated the social media spheres of my world and the people I talk to. So cool. I like to highlight what you're doing and what you're saying, but also kind of get to know you. And I saw that on your Facebook page, you posted this very small snippet of a story that I'm sure is much bigger, but as a kid, you and your father hiked down the Grand Canyon to the river and then back up in a single day. And I got curious, I want to know this story. What happened here?
Yeah, so we lived in Ontario, Canada at the time, near Toronto. And my dad had his family, mom and dad and brothers and sisters, they all lived in, brothers and sister, all lived in California. And so every year for quite a while, we would pile into some vehicle. It could have been a camper van all the way down to a Datsun station wagon, 7 of us. And drive to California. But on the way, I think I've seen more national parks and tourist locations than most Americans. I've seen tons of stuff. And one of the places we stopped off at, more than once, but this one time was Grand Canyon. And we were at the top of the Grand Canyon, and we were sleeping in a couple tents. And my dad woke me up early, and my brother, Mark, who's 2 years younger than I, and told us to put on our running shoes. We were hiking down the Grand Canyon. Wow. And I don't remember carrying anything. I was just a kid. I was probably just barely a teenager. And we started it was before dawn, and we started walking down the Grand Canyon from one of the rims. I can't remember, but it was, way up there. And we hiked all the way down. It was on the one hand terrifying because the trail is quite thin in spots, and then you're passing mules, people riding on mules, or they're passing you, and a sheer drop forever on one side, and then a sheer rise going up. And we made it down halfway. There was a like a green area, and then we continued on down to the Colorado River, and was just this raging brown, cold river. Refreshed ourselves and started climbing back up. We got home after dark. My mom and the rest of the family were freaking out because of course back then there were cell phones or anything, and I did that in one day.
Wow.
Like that's something you plan, right? That's something you prepare for because it was an ordeal. And I slept well that night and
I bet.
felt it the next day. And yeah, it was something else. Yeah. But
What did you?
I wrote that story because it's kind of that's the kind of a person I am. I've come to discover like I do things like that. Like I I am more of a like I love sports, but I am more of an individual sports guy.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not crazy about teams, being a part of a team. When it comes to athletics or whatever, I prefer going for long hikes by myself or with my wife, or for long runs or long rucks, carrying weight on my back.
Mm-hmm.
And I I I am loyal to a fault. I never give up. I stay with things forever beyond their, shelf life.
Mm.
And I and that's one of the things that I think has contributed to Naked Pastor becoming more and more popular or well known or infamous, whichever descriptor you want to use,
Mm-hmm.
is that I just won't go away. And I look back at that Grand Canyon trip and think, yeah, that's kind of in my DNA. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Well, my goodness, I can only imagine. Like, I've not been to the Grand Canyon. It's on it's on one of my bucket lists to go see that. But I know it's big, and I can't imagine going all the way down and back up in one day. My goodness.
It was incredible. A few years ago, I had a public speaking engagement in Salt Lake City, and with a group of ex-Mormons, and one of my sons, Joshua, met me there, and then from there we went to Zion National Park, which is before the Grand Canyon. It's the same part of the same system. And we started at the very, very top where the stream, a little tiny creek, and we followed this down through the Zion National Park, the canyons and everything. And that's where the Grand Canyon starts. That's the beginning of it.
Oh, wow.
And it's just magnificent. That whole chain of mountains and canyons, and it's just remarkable. It's just stunning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, part of your story is becoming a pastor and then exiting that vocation. And I guess that must have been really difficult on many levels, but even just it going against your DNA. You said you just stick with things forever and ever.
Yeah.
And I'd like to get to that point, but I'd like to know also, like, what kind of soil did your life grow up out of, and how did faith play a part in that, your origin story?
Yeah. So I grew up in I would say it was a nominally Christian home. So like my mom and dad were Christians. My dad came from England when he was 16. So he was like Church of England,
Mm-hmm.
in Canada, Anglican, in the US, mainly Episcopal. So it was kind of a Christian-y kind of a home, like a religious home, a conservative Christian home, I suppose. We weren't born again yet, though.
Oh, yeah.
Although my mom and dad were born again at a Billy Graham crusade before I came along.
Okay.
In Toronto. And that's where I was born, in Toronto. So I grew up in this kind of religious-y home, and my dad was a cop who was transferred here and there in Ontario. And so we never went to any one denomination church. We just went to whatever was nearby or the happening place in town or whatever. So I grew up, even though I was born and baptized Anglican, we were never faithful to any one denomination. Like we just went to whatever church. And I think that's also put something in my DNA about my I call myself my own ecumenical movement because I've been in so many churches, and
Yeah.
it's like I don't care, you
Hmm.
know, I don't feel faithful or whatever to any one theology, and I think every theology has something to contribute, hopefully. And then it was when I was 16 or so, I got saved at a Baptist boys club, and then convinced my mom and dad to go to this Baptist church, and we all did. And then we went from there to a Pentecostal church. And then I went from there to a Pentecostal Bible college. And then I went from there to an evangelical seminary, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Boston area.
Hmm.
And ended up, I thought I was headed towards being a Bible scholar. I studied under Dr. Gordon Fee,
Oh, wow.
be a New Testament scholar,
Yeah.
took all the Greek, all the Hebrew, all the theological French and German and Aramaic, you name it, I took it all. And long story short, I kind of got sidelined into the ministry. It was totally by accident. That's another story in and of itself. But I ended up in the ministry and was ordained as a Presbyterian minister in Canada.
Wow.
And served the Presbyterian Church in Canada for about 12 years. Left that, and about a year later became a vineyard pastor, pastor of vineyard churches. And I did that until 2010 when I left the ministry, and then I focused full time on my blog that had already been running for 5 years called Naked Pastor, and that's what I do full time. So basically, that's my story in a nutshell. Is I've been around. I've been around the block. I've been into all kinds of denominations. I've pastored different kinds of churches, and but I felt that my time in the ministry was up in 2010 when I felt the congregation could no longer make room for me in my search for what is true, and I felt it was best for me at that time, and best for the church at that time if I left, and so I did.
Mm.
You know,
What I'm sure that was a progression where you're starting to come to, different awarenesses of, things that you're starting to question, things that you're not sure you believe anymore. I was wondering if you could, if you can back it up, is there like a first domino for you that was just like, that's the time, or this, event or belief or information that came in that really started to get me to say, maybe this thing in my head that I call my faith is not matching the lived experience of my human life?
I can totally tell you all about that.
All right.
I totally remember the moment.
You remember the moment. This is the first domino.
It was a moment. It was a moment. Yeah.
Tell me.
I was in seminary, and like I said, I was taking a master's in New Testament studies. And my mentor was Dr. Gordon Fee, who was a New Testament textual critic, highly respected in the New Testament world. Mm-hmm. And that was who I was sort of mentoring. I was sort of being mentored in that direction. Eventually I went to University of Toronto and started my PhD in New Testament studies. And that's when I got sidelined into the ministry. But when I was graduating from seminary, there was a few days there where I'd completed all my work and I had nothing to do but wait for my graduation. And we were down at Harvard or something. I was looking through the bookstore and I came across this book. And I'm going to tell you now because you wouldn't believe how many people say, "What was the book? What was the book?" Mm-hmm. So I'm going to tell you now. It was a little book. I think it was pretty inconsequential. I haven't seen it around, but it rocked my world. And it was by James Breach, called "The Silence of Jesus." And so what he did was he basically took the what was that school, funk, that school that would white, gray, or blackball scriptures.
That one is outside of my realm. I am not sure.
Anyway, and he sort of came to the conclusion that of all the sayings of Jesus, there were 7 that may be authentic.
Oh, now I understand. Yes. Okay.
And then he took those 7 and he applied a Nietzschean hermeneutic to them.
How so?
Listen, this was totally new to me because I was totally in evangelical, progressive evangelical, but evangelical New Testament studies, Greek, Hebrew, the Bible. I grew up in my teen years. I still have my Bibles that are all underlined in different colors, color coded, and writing in the margins. And I was Bible fanatic. I love the Bible. And I studied the Bible, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, all the stuff. And I was reading this book, and it was on my graduation day, and I was already in my cloak and the mitre hat and everything, and I was freaking out. I was freaking out in our apartment. And Lisa's like, "You have to go to your graduation ceremony." Be late. And I went, but I was freaking out because I wasn't sure the Bible was inspired.
Wow.
Anymore.
Wow.
Like the 3 I's: inspired, infallible, inerrant. Those were the 3 big I's. And I doubted it. And I was freaking out because that to me, it wasn't just like a domino. To me, it was more like a Jenga block tower where you take out one block and the whole thing starts to wave back and forth. And that's what it felt like to me. It was totally, absolutely cataclysmic event.
Wow. And the fact that you were open to accepting this might be true, that's interesting because I ran into the same concepts when I was going through my schooling, but I just wrote it off as, well, this is just, academic garbage because I know that this is the 3 I's. I'm sure I'm fine. So it wouldn't be till much later that I would wrestle with that.
No, it
those
wasn't.
Questions.
It wasn't even like I wasn't at that point where I was saying, could this be true? It was like accidentally I had introduced into my brain corrupt code that was going to start chewing away. I intuitively knew I was in trouble. I didn't know exactly how, but it was like my hard drive started, disintegrating.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely devastating. But I had read Karl Barth, and Karl Barth is still one of the theologians I highly respect in many ways, although I read him differently now than I did then. But Karl Barth at one point says, the solution to a problem isn't to go around it or above it or avoid it or dismiss it or ignore it, but through it. Mm-hmm. And so you don't, this was something I learned too in my personal life. Don't make a decision when you're confused. It's best to wait till you have some sort of clarity. So I applied that principle to what I was experiencing. I was like, okay, this is really effing me up right now. So the best thing I can do is, I'm really confused. I'm going to wait for clarity. And so, because on the one hand, I wasn't willing to say the Bible is all, I reject the Bible because it's, I was duped. Neither was I going to ignore that and just pretend the Bible was what I was taught all along. And so I had to try to travel and navigate in between these two poles of blind adherence to what I'd already believed or careless rejection of everything I'd been taught. I had to figure out how to navigate between those two.
Yeah.
What I felt were treacherous rocks in the stream. And I don't judge anybody who does either one of those. We all have our own ways to cope with truth or, how we evolve our beliefs or, whatever. So I don't judge anybody who does reject the Bible or hugs onto the Bible for dear life and rejects all questions. I don't blame them because it is traumatizing. I know how traumatizing it is. Yeah. And so I just decided to navigate between those two poles. And I did that the whole time I was in the ministry.
Wow.
Waiting for clarity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That must have been like really treacherous to have this information on one side and then to have like a vocation and a love on the other side and trying to find that that middle ground. And like you, I have friends on both sides of those spectrums. Some, I find some people who are like recovering addicts, they need a very rigid fundamentalist view of the faith because they need that structure to stay clean. And so I try to make space for people on that end of the spectrum to like, I get what you're doing and why you need that, and I support that. But then I have, friends who have been utterly traumatized by the religious systems of our day, and they have tossed it all out. They're like, I can't, I'm done. And so I make space for them as well. And then, I'm like you, I have been trying to navigate this middle ground of, I know academically these truths about the Bible, and then I know that blind adherence to the Bible over here and I've been trying to read it differently, as instead of saying, well, the Bible is this inspired, infallible, piece of literature given to us by God, and trying to say, well, this is sacred text, and how do I approach and read sacred text? And that's been really helpful for me and my because I learned Greek as a teenager because I was a dork and all that kind of stuff, and fell in love with the Bible. I read Gordon Fee, like that utterly transformed me at an early stage of my life. When you said you're with Gordon Fee, I was like, oh my gosh, I got his book. I haven't read it in years, but he got me through some
How to Read the Bible
stuff.
For All It's Worth, maybe.
Yep, that one. He was so helpful for me at a stage in my life when I was trying to figure stuff out. But that must have been really treacherous to just navigate that, and to know, like, I kind of have a vested interest being a pastor to just, pretend as it's all hook, line, and sinker, inspired, infallible. How did you navigate that? What kind of landmines did you have to avoid, and what kind of tensions did you have to hold to stay on the ridge?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. I know a lot of pastors, ministers, priests, imams, rabbis who really struggle with that, and they struggle with imposter syndrome, or they don't feel like they're being honest with themselves or with the congregation, or whatever. I know, but I never had that struggle. I always seem to find myself, or maybe a better way to say that, I always seem to gravitate towards congregations who I felt I had a permission to explore and continue growing in my faith or my spirituality or whatever. And so, and I ended up being in congregations where I felt like I could be authentic from the pulpit and pose questions and so on. Because for me, it wasn't like, I know some people who deconstruct overnight, and that hasn't been my experience. My experience has been a very slow glacial erosion, like a melt that takes decades, and literally it's been over 30 years. And since that moment, well, jeepers, we're probably 40 years now since that moment when I was graduating. And so for me, it's not like I'm slow at making decisions. What it is, I think, is trying to figure out how to integrate all that I know or sense to be true with what is true, or what I think is true. And so when in 2009, I had a very profound kind of a flash of insight, or this profound moment where I saw and felt and knew the oneness of all things. I could go into depth on that, but basically the nutshell of that story is that I just suddenly, all the pieces of the puzzle came together, and I saw the full picture, the oneness of everything. And it was like instantaneous. I felt peace of mind. That struggle to integrate and understand and navigate, and all these things, it just went away. The struggle just went away. The anxiety, the spiritual angst, the theological confusion just all left. And I felt this peace of mind come upon me, and I started sharing that in my blog on Naked Pastor, and that's when I started getting letters of concern calls from head office, and so on, and people saying, it sounds like you've got a heretic on your hands, and and was within the year that I left the ministry, because I felt there was no longer room for me there. And it was pretty clear that they didn't think there was room for me there. So it was a mutual understanding that we had become theologically incompatible. It was the technical term, and I left.
Well, that
you see, that peace of mind that came, that moment, that just like that moment of terror that happened on graduation day was matched by that moment of peace. It's incredible that those two brackets, those two moments, bracketed in decades of theological angst and searching and struggle, and then trying to live that out while in the ministry. And then when I left the ministry in 2010, even though it was one of the most traumatic things that Lisa and I have ever done, Lisa being my wife, it's also one of the best things I've ever done. And I'm really glad I did that, because now I feel free to explore and try to understand, and I feel freed up to help others in similar journeys.
Yeah. Well, I'm really interested in that moment, that kind of realizing the oneness of all things. That sounds like I'm kind of a student of Buddhism. I wouldn't say I'm a practicing Buddhism, but I practice, meditation practices from that tradition. But it sounds like what they would call enlightenment or awakening, like that split second awareness kind of a thing.
I hesitate to call it that because I have nothing to compare it to. It's such an unusual moment for me. And I wouldn't dare say I'm enlightened or, I had a moment of awareness, or I call it a flash of insight, because that was what it was that it was like a flash. It only took a few seconds. And I also get people saying, were you on mushrooms? No, I was totally not. And that flash of insight came of the union of all things. And I could see a Christian, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Jew, an atheist, a Hindu, whatever, all looking at the same thing, interpreting it through their own lens. But it was still the one thing. It was still only the one thing. That's what I saw, was the one thing. But that we all have our own take on it and our own explanations of it. And so you can see how that relates to my anxiety over, is Scripture inspired or not? Because then I saw Scripture as one take on reality. That's heretical to many people to hear that, or for me to say that. But that's what I saw, was that there are many interpretations of reality as there are people interpreting it. And but that doesn't change the fact there's just one reality. And so that's what I saw in that flash of insight, that oneness of everything. It was very, very profound. I heard this analogy. There's some scientists and so on and philosophers speculate that we live in a holographic universe where, everything we think we see is a projection of all kinds of different things. So, and they give an analogy of, let's say there's a fish in a fish bowl and in an aquarium, and you have a camera on this side looking at the fish, and you have a camera on this side looking at the fish. And what the camera has separate screens. There's two different screens. And so you're looking at one screen, and you're looking at fish head on. You're looking at another screen, and you're looking at a fish from the side. Now, if you didn't see the aquarium, you might think you're looking at two different fish. But the curious thing is, when the one fish moves, the other fish moves. So there seems to be this relation between the two. And that seems to be simultaneous. And, you have quantum physicists saying, when you divide a quark, no matter how far apart they are, when one moves or is stimulated, the other moves and is stimulated simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
Einstein said that's impossible. Nothing can move faster than the speed of light. So it's impossible. He said, and he doesn't believe in anything spooky or miraculous. He called it spooky. But so something else is going on. And so the theory is we're actually looking at the same thing, but our minds divided into parts. And so that's to get back to my point. Sorry for that little bunny trail, but that gets back to my point where Scripture, me looking at Scripture was looking at one perspective. It was one angle on the fish, but there's only one fish. So it's the same with like the Christian Bible, the Jewish Bible, the Upanishads, the Talmud, the Quran, et cetera, science books, all these things, Sam Harris, these are all perspectives on the one fish, the one reality. And I saw that in one moment. It was like, boom, I saw that. And I felt immediate peace of mind after that. It was incredible.
I mean, that sounds a lot like Thomas Merton's Walnut and Fifth moment for him, or Walnut and Fourth, where he was on the corner of Walnut and Fourth in Kentucky, and he just suddenly realized all people were shining like the sun. Just had that awakening. And he hated people. Like, that's why he went in the monastery. He just hated to be around people, and he hated to go into Louisville. He's like, oh my gosh, all the people. I just want to stay in my little, hermit hole and stay there forever. And then there he was on this bustly corner. And I always wanted to go visit there, but they do have a sign that says, this is the corner. So I looked in Google Maps, and they changed the names of the streets, so you got to look for it. But I looked in Google Maps, and I saw the sign. It's there. They have it marked that Thomas Merton had his enlightenment moment here on this corner.
Thomas Merton is one of my spiritual mentors. He was really my first. Actually, Henry Nouwen led me to Thomas Merton. I'm speaking literarily, not face to face. But I have all of his journals, like Thomas Merton's profound influence. He had another similar profound experience when he was standing before the Smiling Buddha in Bangkok, maybe.
I haven't read this one. I'm interested.
Anyway, in his Asian journal.
Okay.
That's another profound moment where he had that same kind of experience.
Yeah, I have a t-shirt that actually says Thomas Merton is my homeboy that somebody made for me because I'm always quoting Thomas Merton. My first introduction to Merton was his final work, Inner Experience. And it took me 3 years to read it because I just kept rereading chapter 1 over and over and over again. And after 3 years, I finally said, I think it's time to move on to chapter 2. And then I finished the whole book, and then I went back to chapter 1 again. And that there was something about that book that just, then I went back to like New Seeds of Contemplation. And then I was like, well, I better read his, very first work here, 7-Story Mountain. And he's been a help for me as well. Yeah, but that enlightenment moment I know you're hesitating to label it, which that means it's a mystical experience. It goes beyond labels.
It was a mystical experience. Yeah, it was a mystical experience, a flash of insight that happened in my bedroom in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
And I wasn't trying or meditating or anything. It was just like, boom. Yeah. Not that I haven't tried. Oh my God, all the hours and hours and hours I put into meditating and contemplative reading and all the writing in my journals and spiritual directors and all the stuff I went through. And in an attempt to understand, and then all it took was that flash, to put that final piece of the puzzle in, and then you could see the whole picture. Yeah. It was really, really, really strange.
I've told this story on the podcast a couple times, but I had a similar situation happen to me. I'm a pastor at a congregational church. I've been here 6 years, come the end of February.
Oh, wow.
And, I've jumped around from church to church, mostly evangelical fundamentalist, non-denominational church plants and all over the place.
Yeah.
And I've always been that guy on the fringe, on the edge. Like, I don't quite buy it hook, line, and sinker, but I am, I'm still in the club, but I'm just on the fringes, and I remember driving here my very first office day, and I had started a meditation practice. I've been doing it for years. And I pull into the parking lot for my very first office day, and I just had this existential breakdown. I said, I can't do this job. I'm not a Christian anymore. And the thing was, for me, it was a flash of insight that I don't need to convert or convince anybody of anything. I'm not trying to, I just didn't believe in that whole conversion thing. I didn't know how to be a Christian or a pastor without needing to convert people and convince people that I was right. And all of a sudden, I just knew it didn't matter I didn't have to convince people I was right and convert them to my way of thinking. And I pulled in and I called my wife. I said, I can't do this job. I'm not a Christian anymore. And she kind of talked me through it and said, well, that doesn't mean you're not a Christian. You just gotta, kind of run with it, walk with it. And I've been here for almost 6 years now. And yeah, I have the parish mentality where the spiritual needs of this neighborhood, I try and just step in and meet those needs. And if you want to come here, that's cool. But mine was a little more existential. I didn't have the moment of peace. I had the moment of panic where I was just like, oh my God, this means all of these things. Like, my whole way of pastoring is now called into question, and I don't know what to do with that. We're taking a quick break here mid-show to let you know of an opportunity that Choir is offering. Are you deconstructing your faith? It's tough, believe me, I know, I've done it. But what if you didn't have to do it alone? Imagine having guides like Jim Palmer, Kristen Dumais, Jennifer Knapp, Brad Jerzak, Brian Zahn, Paul Young, and more by your side to help. I know I would have loved that on my journey. Well, now you can. Head on over to choiracademy.com, link will be in the show notes, and register for their Square 2 class using the promo code LIMINAL, and you will get 10% off. This course and community are designed to help you navigate your journey with wisdom and support, all because you're a fan of the Liminal Living podcast. And now back to our show.
Well, I've had those moments of panic as well. Like I remember, I was in a used bookstore. No, I was in a library at a university. I had to sneak away to a library to read spiritual books that I wasn't really allowed to own, kind of thing. So I would sneak to libraries and hide in a corner and read these abstracts or journal pieces or whatever. So I was reading something, and I read something somewhere about this spiritual teacher who had recently, he died 20 years before then, and his name was Krishnamurti. And so I was in a used bookstore sometime later, and there was a tiny little pocket paperback, and just a tiny little thing. I think it was like $1.28 or something like that. And it was by Krishnamurti, called The Urgency of Change. And I bought it, and I took it home, and I was reading that book, and I had a moment of terror when he said something like, the brain's number one job is to protect the organism. So it's always in a state of protection. It's not curious. Mm-hmm. It's security. That's, hunker down and stay safe, Mm-hmm. And I felt this cold go through my body. Because I knew it was true, that my brain is resistant to new ideas or transformation, And one of my favorite verses always was, therefore be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I always thought I was up for that, but I knew instinctively, no,
that's not my brain's job.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That was a moment of terror for me. Like, how do you overcome that? When the Bible says, crucify yourself, who is it that is doing the crucifying? And who's it crucifying? Who's left? You know what I mean? Like those kind of questions really, really disturbed me. And I remember all of a sudden thinking, yeah, you know, crucify yourself. And I was thinking, wait a minute. I remember that moment of terror, like who's actually doing the crucifying? If it's crucifying me, who's it was absolute moment of terror. So you said your ministry is called into question by who? You or
Yeah, me. I didn't know how to pastor because the fundamental underpinnings of my entire pastoral philosophy like crumbled in that moment.
Yeah.
And then I didn't know how. And like the church that I'm in now is not creedal, it's covenantal. So I was free to explore new ways of being a pastor here. And it's, we follow liturgical cycles and years and all that. And I've just got into a rhythm of, just being we're in a small town, about 1,500 people, and we're in the downtown area. And so we're very centrally located, and it's just, we are the community's church. You don't have to come here. But I will meet the needs of the people that are around me.
Right.
Just adopted the parish mentality, a different mentality altogether. And trying to meet the physical, emotional, spiritual needs of the people in the vicinity without trying to convert them and convince them and then adopt them into some system of, believing and behaving in order to belong. It's just it's an entirely new way of being a pastor. And there's people that come to the church now that said, I never thought I'd be able to come to a church ever again, but I feel like it can come to this one. It feels safe. I feel like I can be me and I can have my questions and my doubts, and I'm not, my validity as a human is not called into question here. And so that's feel good, because that's what I wanted to have happen, is to have a safe place.
It sounds great. Yeah. Sounds great.
I had to give up the previous way of pastoring in order to embrace the new one. And I think like that liminal space of where you have to reject the old way of being, the brain doesn't want to do that. Like the brain just, there's something spiritual that I think pushes us forward that the brain is resistant to. And I'm wondering if like denominations, organizations, they're like the brain of collective humanities, how we organize ourselves, and they don't want to change because it's all about security, and don't change because then that threatens this system. But then there's those of us who are on the fringes, on the edges, the prophets, the poets, and the artists, and we're always driving for the change and transformation of the organization. The organization's then resistant to that. And so there's got to be a way of, I guess, there's always that tension between the monarchical tradition of the Old Testament and the prophetic. We're stuck in this moment where the old brains that are running all the systems of religion and denominations are falling apart. They're, doubling down on conservative viewpoints. They're selling their souls to politics. They're doing all this horrible stuff. And so many people are leaving and abandoning it. And we're caught in this liminal spot where we don't know where it's going, but certainly can't go backwards anymore. If you could wave a magic wand and give everyone on earth an epiphany, what would it be and why?
That oneness.
The oneness?
Yeah.
What would that look like? What would that do for us?
Well, it's kind of like unity in diversity.
There we go. That's good.
It's
Say
like
more.
oneness, but not sameness. Oneness, but not homogeneity. It's diversity, and it's the oneness. Like that's why that flash of insight that I had was so profound, was because nobody had to forsake their distinctives. Nobody has to forsake their distinctives. Like when it comes to race, gender, sex, language, religion, whatever. And so that's to me what what will make the world work. The best communities that I've ever been a part of or that I've ever pastored, including online. I have an online community right now called The Lasting Supper. And my Instagram community, my TikTok community, whatever, I try to keep them as safe as possible. But the cool thing about those communities are that they're very diverse. You have everything from Bible believing churchgoers and pastors to outright atheists or witches or you name it. They're rabbis, imams, and it's beautiful. That to me is what the world should look like. The world should look like diversity, and that's one of the biggest lessons I learned. When Lisa and I going through deconstruction and all that, and leaving the ministry and having to leave the church because we live in a small town too, and it's just awkward. All that stuff going on, and all the trauma and everything that we went through. The one thing that we learned, the glue that binds us together is not compatibility of beliefs or all that. What binds us together is love. And my love for her, with her differences and distinctives and uniqueness and hers for me, is what makes it work. I don't have to become like her and she doesn't have to become like me in order for love to be real and beautiful. And so I think that's how the world should work in a microcosm, and families and churches and towns and cities and the world. We can be extremely diverse, but if we love and respect one another, it works and it's beautiful. Instead, we have this crazy autocratic fascist idea that everybody needs to believe and think and do and say the same thing. It's insane, it's boring, and it's impossible, it's unrealistic, and it's deadly.
I agree with all of those. Yes, it is. I like that unity doesn't mean uniformity kind of a concept.
Exactly.
I don't think we know how to be a pluralistic society because there's so many different values at play. We don't know which ones to enshrine. And so then we war over the different values that should be enshrined in this place and then govern us and lead us and, define us. And when you have a pluralistic society, that becomes really difficult. But if you do enshrine love, as you're saying, then that becomes that unifying force. Applying, like, in principle, that's good. Applying that to political and religious systems and relationships is really difficult. But I think that is the task ahead of us, is to try and figure out how we get there.
Yeah.
Well,
I think now more than ever, like, the church has two functions, in my opinion. One is pastoral, where you're taking care of people, but the other is prophetic, and where you speak truth to power. But that's because you want to protect the people.
Yeah.
Like, it all comes down to loving and caring for people, our neighbors. And that's why I speak truth to power through my cartoons and so on. Like, I've had a couple of cartoons that are people saying, oh, here you're getting political. Well, love is political, because love has to be boiled down into policy, which is politics. Like, if love is just here in our heads or butterflies in our stomach, that doesn't mean a thing. It has to be manifest in policies. And so, I feel we're at a time right now when we really the church needs to step up and fulfill its prophetic role.
Yeah.
If it cares for its people.
I really like that pastoring means, being prophetic, because, I try to not just let the news feeds of, whatever news organizations like then determine for me what I'm going to say on a Sunday morning in, sermon content or whatever I'm posting. I don't want to just let that be the thing that guides my content. But at the same time, those are the things that are tearing apart the people that I love and pastor. And so having a pastoral presence means addressing, not just taking stances on things to take stances on them, but to, I guess, help define what does love demand from us as a community in this way. If you're going to hold your belief in a way that is weaponized against this other person in our very congregation, that can't be, because we're covenantal and not creedal. It's not the ideas that hold us together. It's our binds to one another. We have bound ourselves together in a covenant to be a community together. And we can't weaponize our politics against each other or our doctrines or, but that pastoral presence is really key to being prophetic. It's not just saying things to be hot topic, but saying things because love demands that we say them.
Karl Barth, I'd mentioned him already.
Yeah.
But he said, preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other.
Mm-hmm.
And people complain when pastors get political or whatever, but I do agree, church should not be telling people who to vote for or whatever. Like that is the wrong kind of politic. What I'm talking about is like why were those in power and the authorities upset with Jesus? Is because his love had practical ramifications on the way they structured their societies.
Yeah.
Like he ate with tax collectors and sinners and hung out with sex workers and tax collectors and, etc. And he was destabilizing the way those in power, the powers and the authorities, wanted to run business.
Yeah.
And then you look at the Old Testament prophets, you look at John, you look at Paul, like they all had run-ins with those in power because their vision for the world overturned or challenged the status quo. And so when I feel that the life of my brother or sister, a trans friend, a gay friend, a black friend, a First Nations friend, a woman friend, if I feel that they're a Mexican friend, if I feel that their lives are being threatened, then of course I'm going to employ the Bible or Jesus or whoever to help undermine that foolishness, that deadly theology,
Yeah.
So I think, I think it's we need to be relevant because right now people are scared, and those who aren't scared are thrilled for the wrong reasons, and so I think that needs to be challenged.
Yeah. I try to stay in the Gospels when I preach, because it's just a lot easier for me. I don't have to unteach, Well, I know what we all think this passage means, but let's unteach it for 3/4 of the sermon. Then I don't have time for that. So I just stay in the Gospels. And, I always ask the questions, why? Like, why did they get mad that he said this?
Yeah.
And, when he cleared the temple, I said the reason everyone wanted him dead was because he interrupted their economic system. That this was the week that they were going to earn 75% of their GDP. And he just disrupted their economic system. They want him dead now. It's like, that's very political. Mm-hmm. And it's really easy to just say, oh, he was making a religious statement. But when you really dive into the inner workings of what Jesus was saying and doing, and then you mirror that with the political and religious systems and structures of his day, you just think, wow, this guy was controversial. I mean, he was crucified for treason and blasphemy. So these are hot topics.
Well, it's still, the weird thing is, after 2 millennia, of having the Gospels, that Christians are finding Jesus offensive again, so that, somebody preaches from the Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes, and suddenly they don't like this woke Jesus, you know what I mean? So it's like, all right, we're back to square one again. Never saw this happening, saw this coming, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, what advice would you give to pastors who feel like they have to be fake, every week, or else they're going to get fired? Or what advice would you give the congregations whose pastors are starting to get honest with themselves and their congregations? I guess, what would you say to those two groups of people?
It's such a delicate dance, man. I was there for 30 years, where the dance is you with your own calling, and you with your congregation, and then you with your superiors, your denomination or whatever. And it's a real hard, balance. And I know this is easy for me to say because, I left the ministry twice. And the last time was the final one. But actually, I left 3 times. Just realized. And the third one was the charm.
Yeah,
But
3 times the charm.
do I have a moment to share a story?
Yeah.
So the first time I left the ministry, I was in the Presbyterian church. And I had been asked to plant a church, and I thought, this is my chance to create the church of my dreams from scratch. So I took the offer, Presbyterian church, to plant it from scratch. And I planted this church, and it was 2 years in, and I hated my job. I hated it. And because what it did was it pulled out all the lapsed Presbyterians from the area, and they all came, and they all had money and power and influence, and turned it into this old Orthodox, boring Presbyterian. I hated it. And I remember going to bed one night thinking, what do I do? Like, I got 3 little kids. I've got my wife. We were living in the manse or the parsonage, whatever you want to call it. And relying on their kids in schools, relying on my income. And this is the only thing I know what to do. Like, what do I do? I felt so trapped, and I felt so hopeless and depressed. I thought, this is me for the rest of my life, And then I had a dream that night, and all I heard were the words, "It's time." And I woke up laughing. And early in the morning, I woke up laughing my head off. Lisa starts laughing. The kids come running in, jump on the bed. What's so funny? Everybody's laughing. I said, I'm not trapped. I just realized I'm not trapped at all. I can just quit. And, what I realized was I was afraid of the consequences of acting free.
Wow.
That if I acted free, it means I would quit, but I'd also have to give up my pay, my home, my, all that stuff. But I said, we can figure this out. Like I can just quit. And Lisa said, okay. So within 2 weeks, we were gone. And that began one of the biggest adventures of our life. But I learned a huge lesson that when you're feeling trapped, it's really not that you're trapped. It's that there are consequences to you acting free. Sometimes they're very legitimate and you need to wait or whatever, but other times it's like a woman trapped in an abusive marriage. You're not really trapped, but it could be dangerous to act free. So I totally understand that. There are all kinds of disclaimers and, cautionary, advice and all that too. But I realized I wasn't trapped. And so we quit, and I ended up being unemployed for a year. It was hard, but it was an exciting adventure, and it taught me a huge lesson. So that when I got in situations again, when I returned to the ministry and I was pastoring and I was unhappy or I felt trapped or, whatever, I always strove to be true to myself and to be as authentic as possible and to negotiate that with the congregation always, at leadership meetings and all that kind of thing, honestly and truthfully bearing my soul, saying, this is where I'm at, and as long as we were all on board and everybody was okay, then we could keep going. But it was communication and being open and honest, and me having the courage to live my truth. But if it got to the point where I felt I was trapped, then I could just leave at any time. And I did that 2 more times after that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That is courageous. I had a very similar experience, but again, it wasn't, it was more forced upon me. I was at a church plant. I had burned out at a church previous that kind of imploded upon itself. And I left there and I went to a church plant, and I was like, oh, it's already great. I just have to not wreck it. This is the church of my dreams kind of a thing. But I was doing the exact same job, just in a different place for different people.
Yeah.
And I didn't put it in together in my head that nothing changed except my geography. And I ended up burning out. I was about 155 pounds. I'm 6'5", so 155 was like nothing. I had like a breakdown. Ended up curled in a ball on top of the washer, just crying. And I didn't know what was wrong. The very next week, the pastor came up to me and he says, I got bad news. I don't have enough money for your next paycheck. He says, we've doubled the attendance, but the giving just hasn't followed. And, we hired you on a savings that just isn't there anymore. And I don't have enough money for your next paycheck. And the relief that flooded over my body, like, you mean I can stop now? The relief just was like, oh, finally, I can just be done.
Yeah.
And then driving home, I was like, wait, how am I going to do this? And how am I going to do that? All the panic moment of, okay, I got to figure this out. But I did. We figured it out. And that led me to searching for the place that I would fit. It was a 6-year search, but I got here. And
that's cool.
But it was more of like that. It was forced upon me because I couldn't muster the courage to do it myself. And then it was just thrust upon me, and I was like, all the relief that flooded my body was amazing. I was like, I can stop now.
Yeah.
And
it's amazing. Like I did discover, when you are true to yourself, or when you accept, the turn of events that happen to you and so on, that I think the Irish have a saying that the ground rises to meet your feet. And that's been my experience, that somehow I've landed on my feet, or in a new place that's better than before. And I'm experienced more freedom to be myself and my authentic self,
Yeah.
So like right now, I'm doing what I love, and I don't have a boss, and I feel like I'm fulfilling what I'm supposed to be doing on the earth, So that wouldn't have happened unless I'd resigned or been fired or whatever. So it worked out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, last question. What spiritual practices would you recommend to someone who is on the journey of deconstruction? Maybe something for the beginner, someone who's well on their way, and then someone who has exited spirituality altogether. Are there a different practice you would give everyone, or just one practice blanket cover?
Well, it really depends. Like that, this is something I harp about quite a bit, is there's only one way to deconstruct, I say, and that's your way.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole point of deconstruction is to achieve your own spiritual independence, your autonomy, self-determination. And mine will look entirely different than yours, Tom, and entirely different from everybody else's. And so the spiritual practice really, and this is going to sound a little obscene maybe to some people, but do whatever the F you want. Like, just figure out what is your way of being spiritual. Like, I have my way, but it might not be your way. So like, just what is it that draws you? What appeals to you? Write in your journal and figure out, okay, what is it that I resonate with?
Mm-hmm.
And it might have been, I might resonate with crystals and incense and a drum circle. I don't know. Whatever it is, figure out what it is that resonates with you and explore that. Just explore it. Not, you don't have to sign up or anything. Just explore it and find out and figure out what is it that makes you feel most alive and most authentic and most genuine and most independent, and do that. So that's why I would hesitate to say, oh, you should meditate an hour every day. You should write in your journal. You should get a spiritual director. No, figure out what it is you want to do. And that takes, when I left the ministry the first time, I called my mentor, happened to be my uncle. I called my mentor and I was lost. Like, I was like, okay, I had that wonderful dream. I woke up laughing and then I quit. And then it was like, okay, what do I do now?
Mm-hmm.
And I called him and he said, well, what do you want, David? What do you want? And I couldn't answer that question.
Yeah.
I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't even know what I wanted because I was never allowed to want. I always had to do what God wanted. I was never allowed to know what my desires were or what my dreams were or what I wanted. I had to want what the Lord wanted. And so that was my spiritual practice, was just figuring out what the hell I wanted. Even I was in my 30s. I didn't even know what I wanted, so that to me was my spiritual exercise way back then. Yours could be different,
Yeah. Oh, that's good. I read Ronald Rolheiser, Catholic priest, trying to remember the name of the book, Holy Longing. And he said something very similar that says, what you do with your longing is your spirituality. That's and then he goes into that's the eros energy, the love, the eros love that drives all spiritual forces. You can either integrate yourself with that desire or disintegrate yourself with that desire. That book changed the way I saw spiritual practice, because it really gave that, like what you're saying, just like what do you desire, what do you long for, and then what you do to fulfill that longing is your spirituality. Is it healthy and integrating, or is it unhealthy and disintegrating?
Yeah.
And man, that just really opened some doors for my mind. That was good.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's what resonates with you, right?
Yeah.
So from a very early age, when I was in my early 20s and I had a profound spiritual crisis in my life, and I came across Nowen, and then he led me through his book on Merton. And Merton was a memoirist, so he kept all of his journals. In fact, he was required, when he entered the monastery, you're supposed to sacrifice everything and slip into the night of being a monk and never be heard from again.
Yeah. And
he wanted to stop writing, and they were like, no, that's going to be your cross. That's going to be your spiritual exercise, is writing. And so he kept journals. And that for me, that's when I started journaling. And I've been journaling ever since. And that's how he mentored me, was just journaling and getting in touch with my own self, my own thoughts, my own feelings, and my own events. And so that was very profound.
Wow. Gosh, I feel like I could just talk all day. This has been such a fun, great conversation. And I do want to thank you for giving me over an hour of your time to be on the show. It's been great. Where would you like to send folks to connect with your work? Maybe purchase some art or some books? What do you like to?
So nakedpastor.com is my website. That's home base.
Okay.
And I have an online community as well on another website called thelasting supper.com. So the Lasting Supper.
Okay.
for people who are deconstructing and who want to continue finding support. You can go there. So yeah, but that's where you can find me, and I'm Naked Pastor across all social media platforms. So
all right, I got those there. I'm going to put them in the show notes so people can just click on them and head there and check out some stuff.
Awesome.
Well, again, David, thank you so much for just coming on the show and sharing your life and your heart with my listeners and me. I learned a lot. This has been really good.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah. Invite me back sometime if you want to talk about any certain topic. That would be fun too. I think we would have a conversation.
Yeah, I will definitely hone in. I'll be thinking of that, and we'll have you back on for sure.
All right, man. Have a good one.
You too.
I'll say bye.